This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The lie we were sold about bullies. I need to say something that might make you uncomfortable. Bullying did not end when I graduated high school. It just learned better manners. It stopped slamming locker doors and started sending calendar invites. It stopped spreading rumors in hallways and started copying people on emails. It stopped laughing in my face and started smiling while doing it. And for years, I didn't call it bullying. I called it miscommunication. I called it office politics. I called it family dynamics. I called it just how she is. I called it marriage is hard. What I did not call it was what it actually was. Targeting, subtle, polished, plausibly deniable targeting. If you are listening to this alone tonight, headphones in, house quiet, and you feel that dull exhaustion in your chest that you can't quite explain, I want you to stay with me. Because I'm not talking about dramatic cruelty. I'm talking about the small, strategic moments that make you question yourself. The meeting where I was interrupted 3 times but somehow labeled too intense when I asserted a point. The dinner in Chicago where a woman complimented my promotion in a tone that sounded like concern, not celebration. The family gathering where someone joked about my divorce just loud enough for the table to hear. No one screamed at me. No one threatened me. No one left visible bruises. But I went home and replayed every word in my head. And that replay is the bruise. The lie we were sold is this: mature women should be above it. We were told that if we are confident, educated, financially independent, and emotionally intelligent, we will no longer be targets. That's not true. In fact, sometimes those qualities make us more interesting to provoke. Because adult bullying is not about chaos. It is about control, and the most dangerous form of it is the kind that hides behind civility. I didn't recognize it at first, because I was trained not to. I was trained to smooth things over. I was trained to assume good intentions. I was trained to be the stable one, the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who doesn't make things awkward. So when someone made a cutting remark, I adjusted myself. When someone subtly competed with me, I downplayed my success. When someone questioned my choices, I explained. Do you know what explaining is? It's a quiet form of surrender. I didn't see that at 35. I see it now. That's because every time I explained myself to someone who had no intention of understanding me, I stepped into their frame. I accepted their premise that I needed to justify my existence. And the most exhausting part? I did it with a smile. There is a specific kind of fatigue that women between 35 and 60 carry. It isn't crisis fatigue. It isn't survival fatigue. It's performance fatigue. The fatigue of always appearing steady, of being the emotional shock absorber in every room, of knowing how to regulate yourself so well that no one ever sees the cost. I wasn't crying in bathrooms. I wasn't having breakdowns. I was functioning, thriving even. I paid my mortgage on time. I stayed in shape. I showed up to work prepared. I kept friendships alive. From the outside, I was fine. But inside, there was a quiet erosion happening. And erosion is slow. And it doesn't announce itself. It wears you down grain by grain. The lie we were sold is that strength means tolerance. That being evolved means absorbing. That being mature means rising above, silently. But rising above is not the same as enduring without boundaries. Somewhere along the way, I confused composure with submission. I confused kindness with self-abandonment. I confused emotional intelligence with emotional labor. And here is the part that shocked me when I finally admitted it to myself. Some people were feeding off my restraint, not because they hated me, but because my reaction validated them. When someone makes a small dig and sees your jaw tighten, they register impact. When someone questions your decision and watches you rush to explain, they feel influence. When someone competes with you and you engage, they feel equalized. I didn't understand the reinforcement loop at first. I just knew I felt drained around certain people, not devastated, drained, like a battery that kept being used but never fully recharged. And because the behavior was subtle, I kept doubting myself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm reading into it. Maybe she didn't mean it that way. Maybe I'm projecting. Let me tell you something gently, but clearly. Chronic confusion is not sensitivity. It is often a signal. Healthy interactions do not leave you spinning at midnight. They do not make you rehearse conversations in the shower. They do not make you question your tone for hours afterward. The older I get, the more I realize that adult bullying is rarely loud. It is strategic. It thrives in gray areas. It relies on plausible deniability. If I offended you, that wasn't my intention. You're taking it the wrong way. I was just joking. Those phrases are shields, and for years I lowered my sword before I even realized I was in a duel. Not because I'm weak, but because I was conditioned to avoid conflict at all costs, especially as a woman, especially as a competent woman, especially as a woman who prides herself on being emotionally regulated. But emotional regulation without boundaries becomes self-erasure. That was the turning point for me. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. I realized I didn't want to become cold. I didn't want to become sharp or bitter or cynical. I just wanted to stop absorbing. I wanted to move through rooms without bracing. I wanted to attend dinners without anticipating subtext. And I wanted to exist without explaining. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The reason adult bullying continues is not because we are powerless. It continues because we are polite, because we are capable, because we are composed, because we are strong enough to absorb it. But absorption has a cost, and no one talks about that cost. No one talks about the invisible labor of constantly being the bigger person. No one talks about the quiet resentment that builds when you are always the mature one. No one talks about how isolating it feels to be admired for your strength, but never allowed your softness. If you have ever felt that, not broken, not destroyed, just quietly worn down, I need you to know something. You are not dramatic. You are not fragile. You are not imagining patterns. You are noticing them. And noticing is the beginning of power. Not loud power, not performative power, internal power. The kind that doesn't argue, the kind that doesn't defend, the kind that doesn't need applause. In the next part of this conversation, I'm going to show you what changed for me when I stopped trying to be understood by everyone, when I stopped rushing to correct narratives, when I stopped reacting on cue. But before we go any further, if this resonates, if you recognize yourself in these quiet moments, subscribe to this channel. Not because I'm promising you a transformation, not because I'm selling empowerment, but because I am building a space for women who are steady on the outside and searching on the inside, and that deserves continuity. If this channel speaks to you, subscribing is how you tell me to keep going. And because this isn't about becoming harder, it's about becoming untouchable without losing myself. And that begins with seeing the lie clearly. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. They don't want me. They want my reaction. There was a moment at that dinner in Chicago with Melissa that I did not understand until much later. On the surface, it was ordinary. Low lighting, a long wooden table, wine glasses catching reflections from the city skyline. Successful women talking about work, travel, aging parents, Pilates studios, investment properties. the kind of evening that looks effortless from the outside. Melissa had always been polished, intelligent, measured, the kind of woman who never raises her voice but somehow manages to control the temperature of a room. When the conversation shifted to my recent promotion, and she smiled in a way that felt almost warm. "That must be a lot," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I don't know how you manage something that intense at this stage of life." At this stage of life, it was subtle, almost elegant, but there it was. The old version of me would have rushed in. I would have softened it for her. I would have reassured her. I would have laughed lightly and said something self-deprecating like, "Oh, it's not that serious." Or, "I probably won't do it forever." Or, "I just like staying busy." That's what I used to do when something inside me felt poked. I performed comfort for the person who had just unsettled me. But something in me had been shifting long before that dinner. I had grown tired of leaving interactions feeling slightly smaller than when I entered them. So I did something different. I paused. Not dramatically, not defiantly. I simply let the space breathe. And in that breath, I noticed something I had never fully seen before. She was watching me, not casually, intently. She was waiting. For what? For my reaction. That was the moment it clicked for me, in a way that felt almost clinical. This wasn't about my job. It wasn't about my workload. It wasn't even about my life choices. It was about impact. She wanted to see if her words landed. That realization was both unsettling and liberating, because once I saw that, I stopped taking the bait personally. I started seeing a pattern that extended far beyond Melissa. In meetings, in friendships, in family dynamics, certain comments weren't conversations. They were probes, little psychological feelers sent out to measure how much influence someone had over me. When someone makes a cutting remark and then studies your face, they are not curious about your answer. They are curious about your response. There is a difference. I used to believe strength meant responding quickly and intelligently. I thought I had to demonstrate that I could defend myself in real time, that I could match tone with tone, intellect with intellect. But reaction is not the same as strength. Reaction is evidence. It is feedback. It is fuel. And once I understood that, I became very careful about what I fed. The nervous system plays a bigger role in this than we admit. When someone says something provocative, my body reacts before my mind does. My chest tightens, my shoulders lift, my jaw hardens slightly. My heart rate increases. For years, I interpreted that physiological spike as a cue to speak, and now I interpret it as a cue to wait. I don't silence my reaction internally. I observe it. I let it rise. I let it pass. I have learned that most emotional surges peak and settle within 90 seconds if I don't escalate them with words. 90 seconds of restraint can dismantle a dynamic that used to consume hours of rumination later. That dinner with Melissa lasted 3 hours. The exchange itself lasted less than 10 seconds. But the restraint I practiced in that moment changed how I moved through the world. I smiled, not exaggerated, not sarcastic, just steady. "That's an interesting perspective," I said calmly. "What makes you say that?" I wasn't accusing her. I wasn't defensive. I was redirecting the spotlight. And something subtle shifted. She adjusted in her seat. She backtracked slightly. "Oh, when I just mean, it sounds demanding." Of course it does. But notice what happened. When I did not rush to reassure her, she had to clarify herself. The pressure moved. For years, I had been unconsciously absorbing that pressure. I would sense discomfort and instinctively smooth it over as if it were my responsibility to restore equilibrium. But it wasn't mine. That was another quiet lie I had been living inside. I thought it was my job to make interactions comfortable, especially uncomfortable ones, especially with other women, especially with people who projected subtle envy. I thought composure meant caretaking the emotional climate. Now I understand something different. Composure means managing my own internal state, not managing everyone else's. When I stopped reacting visibly, I noticed patterns more clearly. Some people escalated when they didn't get immediate feedback. They would push harder, sharpen their tone, add another comment. It was almost fascinating, like watching someone tap on glass to see if there's a crack. But if I didn't crack, they lost momentum. And this is where it gets important. When I say they want my reaction, I don't mean they are cartoon villains sitting around plotting my discomfort. I mean that many adults operate unconsciously through reinforcement loops. If a behavior produces visible impact, it is repeated. If it produces none, it weakens. It's behavioral psychology, not drama. When I showed irritation, certain people seemed energized. When I stayed neutral, they seemed confused. That confusion is not cruelty on my part. It is simply the collapse of a pattern. Jen, there's a particular kind of woman in midlife who is especially susceptible to feeding these loops. She is competent. She is capable. She has built a life that works. She is used to solving problems. So when someone directs tension toward her, she tries to solve that too. She explains. She clarifies. She softens. She over-communicates. I know this woman intimately because I am her. What I didn't realize for a long time is that over-communication can be an offering, and not everyone deserves access to that offering. After that dinner, I started practicing what I privately call reaction fasting, small deliberate experiments in withholding immediate response. If someone sent a pointed text, I waited. If someone made a passive-aggressive comment, I responded minimally. If someone tried to provoke comparison, I declined engagement. At first, it felt unnatural. There was an almost addictive pull to clarify myself, to be seen correctly, to prevent misunderstanding. But not every misunderstanding is a crisis, and not every accusation requires defense. When I stopped reacting on demand, I began noticing who respected my steadiness and who resented it. That distinction is revealing. Healthy people do not need visible impact to feel significant. Unhealthy dynamics often do. And here is the quiet truth that changed everything for me. If someone needs my reaction to feel powerful, my reaction is too expensive to give freely. I started protecting it the way I protect my time, deliberately, selectively, without announcement. And something inside me softened, because I was no longer performing resilience in real time. I was choosing it internally, and there is a difference between swallowing emotion and regulating it. Swallowing leaves residue. Regulating creates space. When Melissa made that comment, I did feel something, a flicker of irritation, a flash of defensiveness. But I did not hand it to her. I held it. I examined it. I decided what to do with it. That choice, that small, almost invisible choice, is what made me untouchable in that moment. Not dominance, not clever comebacks, not superiority, just refusal to feed the loop. The older I get, the more I see how much of adulthood is a dance of subtle power exchanges. Most of them are unconscious, but once I see them, I cannot unsee them. And once I stop participating reflexively, I conserve enormous amounts of energy. Energy I used to spend replaying conversations at midnight. On energy I used to spend crafting perfect follow-up emails. Energy I used to spend trying to control how I was perceived. Now when someone tries to provoke, I ask myself quietly, is this a real threat, or is this an invitation to react? Most of the time it's the latter, and invitations can be declined. I don't decline with hostility. I decline with stillness, because they don't want me. They want confirmation, they want evidence, they want to see that they matter enough to shift my internal climate. And sometimes the most dignified thing I can do is let the weather inside me remain unchanged. Not because I am numb, not because I am superior, but because I am selective. Selective with my energy, selective with my emotion, selective with my visibility. That is where my power began to return, quietly, without spectacle, without announcement. I'm just a woman at a dinner table in Chicago, choosing not to flinch, and realizing that the moment she stopped flinching, the dynamic lost its grip. Frame control. I refuse to enter their story about me. There was a time in my life when I believed that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, everything would settle. If someone misunderstood me, I clarified. If someone questioned my decision, I justified. If someone hinted that I was too ambitious, too distant, too intense, too independent, I softened the edges of myself so the label wouldn't stick. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was emotional intelligence. What I did not understand was that every time I rushed to defend myself, I had already accepted someone else's version of the story about me. I had stepped into their frame. And the concept sounds abstract until you see it happen in real time. A frame is simply the lens through which a situation is defined. Whoever sets it determines the rules of engagement. If someone implies that I am selfish for traveling alone, the frame becomes, I have done something questionable. If I immediately begin explaining why solitude matters to me, I have agreed that I am on trial. Even if I win the argument, I am still inside their courtroom. For years, I lived inside other people's courtrooms without realizing it. At work, if a colleague suggested I was overcomplicating a strategy, I would present more data. If someone implied that I was difficult, I would adjust my tone. If a relative framed my divorce as a failure, I would dissect the marriage in painful detail to prove that I had tried. I mistook defense for strength. In reality, defense is reactive positioning. It means I am responding to someone else's narrative instead of standing inside my own. The shift did not happen overnight. It happened in fragments. After the dinner in Chicago with Melissa, I became more aware of subtle framing attempts, not dramatic confrontations, just small, loaded statements presented as facts. You've always been a bit guarded. You don't seem as warm as you used to. You're so driven. I could never prioritize work like that. Each sentence carries an assumption. Guarded, less warm, prioritizing work over something more virtuous. The old version of me would have rushed to dismantle each assumption carefully, like diffusing a bomb. I would have explained context, offered reassurance, provided evidence of my warmth, my balance, my humanity. But I began asking myself a different question. Who decided that was the story? And why am I trying so hard to edit it? I started experimenting with something that felt almost radical in its simplicity. I stopped correcting every narrative about me. When someone said, "You're very career-focused," I responded calmly, "I am focused, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady." When someone said, "You've changed," I replied, "Yes, I have." No explanation, no dissertation, no attempt to ease their discomfort with my evolution. The first few times I did this, my body felt electric. There was a tightness in my chest, a reflexive urge to expand on my answer. Silence after a short statement felt dangerous, as if I had dropped a glass in a quiet room. But something fascinating happened when I allowed that silence to stand. The conversation often shifted, because the other person expected me to fill the space with defense. When I didn't, they had to decide what to do with their own assumption. Sometimes they softened, sometimes they doubled down. And when they doubled down, I learned even more. If someone insists on a particular version of me despite minimal engagement, that tells me the story serves them. It is not about accuracy. It is about control. Frame control is not about overpowering someone. It is about refusing to stand in a narrative that diminishes me. I used to think being misunderstood was a crisis. Now I see it as neutral. People are allowed to misunderstand me. What they are not allowed to do is recruit me into reinforcing that misunderstanding. The most subtle frames are often disguised as concern. I just worry that you're taking on too much. I hope you're not isolating yourself. I don't want you to regret these choices later. On the surface, these statements appear caring, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they are attempts to pull me back into a smaller, more comfortable version of myself. The old me would have rushed to reassure. I would have proven that I was balanced, connected, thoughtful. The newer version of me listens carefully to tone, not just words. If the concern feels genuine, I engage sincerely. If it feels performative, I respond minimally. I appreciate your perspective. That's something to think about. Maybe. The word maybe has become a quiet shield for me. It neither confirms nor denies. It dissolves the expectation that I must justify. There is strength in ambiguity when it is intentional. And one of the hardest lessons for me was accepting that not everyone deserves clarity about my inner world. I used to pride myself on transparency, on open communication, on explaining my reasoning so thoroughly that no one could accuse me of being unclear. But overclarity can be a form of self-exposure. When I explain too much to someone who is committed to misunderstanding me, I am not building connection. I am offering them more material to reinterpret. This became painfully clear during a conversation with a relative in Denver, months after my divorce. The implication was subtle, but present. Perhaps I hadn't tried hard enough. Perhaps I had been too independent. Perhaps I had expected too much. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the need to recount every therapy session, every compromise, every sleepless night, and to present evidence of effort. And then I stopped. I looked at her calmly and said, I made the best decision I could with the information I had. That was it. No backstory, no emotional display, no invitation for cross-examination. It felt almost unnatural to end there, but ending there protected me. When I refuse to enter someone else's frame, I am not being dismissive. I am being selective. I am choosing not to convert my life into a debate. There is something deeply destabilizing about not defending yourself when someone expects you to. It interrupts the script, and scripts are comforting to people who rely on them. If someone is used to positioning themselves as the evaluator, and me as the one being evaluated, my refusal to perform that role unsettles the hierarchy. But that discomfort is not mine to manage. For much of my life, and I believed harmony was my responsibility. Now I understand that harmony built on self-erasure is not harmony, it is containment. When I stopped defending myself automatically, I noticed something else. My energy expanded. I wasn't mentally rehearsing arguments before meetings. I wasn't crafting preemptive explanations for decisions I hadn't even been questioned about yet. I was simply living. There is a freedom in allowing people to think what they think. It does not mean their perception is correct. It means I no longer measure my worth by their interpretation. Frame control begins internally. If I believe that someone else's opinion defines me, I will rush to correct it. If I am anchored in my own understanding of myself, I can let opinions float without chasing them. This does not mean I tolerate disrespect. It means I choose my battleground carefully. There are moments when clarification is necessary, when misinformation affects my work or reputation. In those cases, I respond directly and concisely, not emotionally, not defensively, just factually. The difference is intention. I am no longer defending my identity. I am correcting logistics, and those are not the same. The older I get, the more I value containment over performance. I do not need every room to understand me. I do not need every relationship to validate me. I do not need to dismantle every false assumption about me. I need peace, and peace often requires letting certain narratives exist without engaging them. When Melissa made her comment at dinner, she was offering a frame that my ambition might be excessive, that my season of life might demand something softer. I could have entered that frame and argued for balance, for capability, for nuance. Instead, I remained where I stood, inside my own story. I know why I work the way I do. I know why I travel alone. I know why my marriage ended. I know why I have changed. That knowledge is sufficient. Refusing to enter someone else's story about me is not arrogance. It is alignment. It is the quiet decision to stand in my own narrative without inviting cross-examination from people who are not invested in my well-being. And once I stopped stepping into other people's frames, something surprising happened. Conversations became simpler. My posture became steadier. My words became fewer. I no longer felt the need to be perfectly understood in order to feel secure. That is what frame control gave me, not dominance, not superiority, and just the freedom to exist without constantly defending the shape of my life. Silence is not weakness. It is structure. Silence used to feel like exposure to me. If a room went quiet after I spoke, I rushed to fill it. If someone made a sharp comment, I responded immediately. If there was tension in the air, I dissolved it with words. I believed that quickness meant competence, that smoothness meant control, that the woman who speaks fluently and instantly is the woman who holds power. But I was wrong. The moment that began to unravel that belief happened in Seattle. It was a boardroom on the 23rd floor, glass walls, gray skies pressing against the skyline, a long, polished table with too many laptops open at once. I had spent weeks preparing a proposal. I knew my data. I knew my numbers. I knew the risks and the advantages. Halfway through my presentation, a man across the table leaned back in his chair and interrupted. "You're overcomplicating this," he said casually, as if he were offering a favor. The air shifted. There is a specific kind of interruption that is not about content. It is about control. It is designed to fracture rhythm. I felt the fracture immediately. My chest tightened. My breath shortened. Heat rose along my neck. My old reflex would have kicked in right there. I would have clarified, defended the structure, explained the rationale. I would have tried to regain authority with speed. Instead, something in me paused, not out of strategy, out of instinct. I looked at him, and I said nothing. Not in a dramatic way, not in a confrontational way. I just let the sentence land and hang in the air. Silence entered the room like a third presence. On 5 seconds, 6, 7. In that stretch of quiet, I noticed something I had never truly observed before. Discomfort travels. It does not disappear. It relocates. When he interrupted me, the discomfort landed in my body. When I refused to absorb it with immediate response, it returned to him. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, adjusted his pen. No one else spoke. And then I continued. As I was saying, that was it. I did not argue his point. I did not acknowledge the interruption directly. I did not defend the complexity of my proposal. I resumed my pace, After the meeting, something subtle had changed. No one mentioned the interruption. No one addressed the pause. But the dynamic had shifted in a way I could feel. For the first time, I understood that silence is not absence. It is structure. It is the frame around words. And the person who controls the pauses often controls the power. I had been afraid of silence because I associated it with weakness. Growing up, silence in my family meant disapproval. It meant tension that no one was naming. It meant distance. So I learned to fill it. But adult silence, when chosen deliberately, is different. It is not withdrawal. It is containment. It says, I am not destabilized. There is a psychological phenomenon that plays out in conversations. The first person to rush to fill a gap often reveals anxiety about the gap itself. When I learned to sit inside that gap, even for a few seconds, I discovered how much information is revealed in those seconds. Who fidgets, who laughs nervously, who backtracks, who escalates. Silence is diagnostic, but it is also protective. After Seattle, I began practicing silence in smaller and more intimate contexts. When Melissa made subtle remarks at future gatherings, I did not immediately counter them. I let her words sit between us. Sometimes I would hold eye contact a second longer than usual, not aggressively, just steadily. It is astonishing how much steadiness unsettles someone who is fishing for reaction. In conversations with friends, I began allowing pauses after they spoke instead of responding instantly. I noticed how often people keep talking when given space, revealing more than they intended. Silence invites expansion, and often, expansion reveals truth. There is also a physiological component to this that I did not appreciate until I began paying attention to my body. When I am interrupted or challenged, my nervous system spikes. It prepares me for combat or defense if I speak immediately in that state. And my tone carries that charge. Even if my words are calm, my energy is sharp. When I pause, I give my body time to recalibrate. I inhale slowly through my nose. I exhale longer than I inhale. I ground my feet against the floor. It sounds simple. It is not always easy. But in those few breaths, I regain authorship of my voice. I no longer speak from reflex. I speak from choice. And that distinction has changed the way people interact with me. Silence has also reshaped my digital life. There was a time when I felt compelled to respond to every message quickly, to clarify misunderstandings immediately, to defend tone in text threads. Now, if a message carries an edge, I wait, hours sometimes, not to punish, not to play games, but to ensure that when I do respond, I am not reacting. In that waiting, and I often discover that the urgency dissolves on its own. Sometimes the other person follows up with clarification. Sometimes the issue reveals itself as minor. Silence exposes which tensions are real and which are impulsive. The woman I was 10 years ago would have interpreted silence from others as rejection, as coldness. Now I see that silence can be a boundary. It can be a signal that someone is choosing not to escalate. When I learned to wield silence without hostility, I stopped fearing it in others as well. There is a difference between silent treatment and structured silence. Silent treatment is punitive. It withdraws connection to create anxiety. Structured silence is grounded. It withholds reaction to preserve clarity. The distinction lies in intention. In that boardroom in Seattle, my silence was not meant to embarrass, and it was meant to stabilize. In later moments, when conversations grew heated, I began saying less instead of more. If someone raised their voice, I lowered mine. If someone pushed for immediate answers, I responded with, "Let me think about that." I gave myself permission to slow the tempo, and tempo is powerful. Many subtle power plays rely on speed. on catching someone off guard, on forcing quick responses. When I slow down, I remove that advantage. I step out of urgency and into deliberation. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this practice. Silence requires trust in myself. If I do not believe that my presence is enough without constant verbal reinforcement, I will overcompensate with words. When I sit in silence without shrinking, I am communicating something non-verbally. I am comfortable here. And that comfort changes how others perceive me. Not because I am trying to intimidate, but because steadiness is rare, especially in women who have been socialized to be agreeable and responsive. In rooms where I once felt pressure to perform intelligence quickly, I now let others speak first. I observe. I listen for patterns. I choose my moment. Often, fewer words carry more weight. This does not mean I am silent all the time. It means I am intentional. I no longer fill space to prove competence. I no longer rush to correct every misstatement. I no longer treat every challenge as a debate to win. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to let a statement sit in its own awkwardness. If someone makes a cutting joke and no one laughs, the joke exposes itself. If someone interrupts and I resume without acknowledgement, and the interruption looks smaller, silence can shrink what does not deserve expansion. It can also amplify what does. When I speak after a pause, people listen differently, not because I have demanded attention, but because I have not competed for it. That is the quiet structure I did not understand before Seattle. Silence is not the absence of power. It is the architecture of it. It holds the room steady. It redistributes discomfort. It protects my nervous system. It signals that I am not easily shaken. And perhaps most importantly, it gives me time. Time to decide who deserves my words. Time to choose my tone. Time to remain intact. I used to fear that if I did not respond immediately, I would disappear. Now I know that when I respond deliberately, I become unmistakable. Not louder, not sharper, just grounded. And grounding is what makes silence powerful. Not the void, the structure. Presence before words. There was a time when I believed that if my ideas were strong enough, my presence didn't matter. If I was prepared, articulate, intelligent, that would be enough. But long before I opened my mouth in any room, something else had already spoken for me. My posture, my pace, my eye contact, my stillness, or lack of it. I didn't understand this in my 30s. I thought substance would override signal. I thought depth would outshine demeanor. Then I started noticing patterns. The same idea delivered by two different people would land differently. The same sentence spoken in two different tones would shift the temperature of an entire room. And I began asking myself a quiet question. What am I communicating before I say a word? Presence is not performance. It is not glamour. It is not perfection. It is the unspoken message that says, I am settled inside myself. For years, I did not look settled. Even when I felt composed mentally, my body told a different story. I fidgeted when uncomfortable. I adjusted my sleeves. I checked my phone unnecessarily. I crossed and uncrossed my legs. Tiny movements, barely noticeable but constant. I used to think those habits were harmless. They weren't. They signaled nervous energy, and nervous energy invites testing. Not always consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. Human beings assess vulnerability quickly. Within seconds, we register steadiness or instability, confidence or self-doubt. I used to resent that reality. It felt unfair. Why should my posture influence how seriously I'm taken? But fairness is not the point. Perception shapes interaction. The shift for me began quietly. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about protecting my internal calm. I remember walking into a professional event in Chicago months after that dinner with Melissa. I paused at the entrance longer than usual. Instead of rushing in and scanning for friendly faces, I stood still for a moment. I grounded my feet. I rolled my shoulders back, not stiffly, but naturally. I slowed my breathing, and then I walked. Not faster to look busy, not slower to look dramatic, just steady. The difference was subtle, but I felt it. I was not entering the room to be evaluated. I was entering as someone who belonged. Belonging is an internal decision before it becomes external confirmation. There is something about midlife that makes presence more complicated. Oh no, we carry history in our bodies: stress, grief, divorce, promotions, aging parents, children leaving home, relationships that reshaped us, losses we do not advertise. All of it settles somewhere in the spine, in the shoulders, in the jaw. I started paying attention to how I physically carried my life. When I was tired, I shrank slightly. When I anticipated tension, my chin tilted downward almost imperceptibly. I began correcting these micro habits, not out of vanity, but out of awareness. I practiced standing tall, not as a performance, but as a reminder to myself. I am not under attack. I practiced maintaining eye contact a second longer than felt comfortable, not to intimidate, but to signal steadiness. I learned that when my gaze is steady, interruptions decrease. When my voice is measured, crosstalk softens. When my movements are deliberate, people hesitate before attempting to destabilize. It sounds simple. It is not simplistic. Presence is cumulative. It is influenced by sleep, by fitness, by how I treat my body when no one is watching. There was a period in my life when I neglected that. I told myself I was too busy, too responsible, too needed elsewhere. But I began lifting weights 3 times a week, not because I wanted to transform my appearance, but because I wanted to feel physically anchored. Strength training did something unexpected. It changed the way I occupied space. My shoulders squared naturally. My walk became more grounded. My breathing deepened. I wasn't trying to look stronger. I felt stronger. And that feeling translated into rooms. Clothing shifted too, not toward extravagance, toward structure. Oh, I chose fabrics that held shape, cuts that felt intentional, shoes that allowed me to move confidently rather than delicately. I stopped dressing to blend in. I started dressing to feel contained. Contained does not mean rigid. It means cohesive. When I feel cohesive, I do not leak uncertainty. That cohesion also extends to my digital presence. I used to over-explain in emails, add extra qualifiers, apologize preemptively. Now my messages are clear and concise. No emotional cushioning where it is not required. Tone still matters, but excess explanation is often a signal of insecurity. The less I overcompensate, the more authority my words carry. Presence also shows up in stillness. In conversations with Claire in Miami, I noticed how often she filled silence with comparison. Stories of accomplishments, unsubtle status updates disguised as casual sharing. The old me might have mirrored that energy. The current me leaned back slightly, listened, nodded minimally. I did not rush to match her pace, and something interesting happened. Her energy either escalated or softened. It had nowhere to hook. Presence can neutralize competition before it becomes explicit. I began to understand that bullies, overt or subtle, scan for cracks. Not because they are monsters, but because dominance dynamics are ancient. They look for fidgeting hands, darting eyes, apologetic laughter. They test tone. If they sense hesitation, they push. If they sense steadiness, they recalibrate. The goal is not to intimidate. It is to become a difficult target. There is a difference. Intimidation invites challenge. Steadiness discourages it. And I also stopped multitasking when someone was speaking to me. No glancing at my phone, no half attention. When I give full attention, I signal that I am not distracted by insecurity or urgency. Attention is power. Withholding it strategically is also power. Presence has a sensory component too. My breathing, my pace, my physical proximity. I stopped leaning in excessively when someone challenged me. I stopped shrinking back when someone grew louder. I maintained neutral distance. These are micro-adjustments, almost invisible to observers, but they are transformative internally. They communicate safety to my nervous system. And when my nervous system feels safe, I do not overreact. I do not over-explain. I do not overperform. I simply am. There is something deeply attractive, not romantically, but psychologically, about someone who does not scramble. In my 40s, I realized I had spent years scrambling quietly, trying to anticipate tension, trying to preempt criticism, trying to appear approachable enough to avoid hostility. Now I appear grounded enough to avoid targeting. The difference is subtle, but profound. Approachability without boundaries can invite projection. Groundedness without aggression commands respect. When I walk into a room now, I do not ask myself, who here will like me? I ask myself, am I aligned with myself? That alignment is visible before I speak. It shows in how I sit, in how I hold a glass of water, in how I wait before answering, in how I decline invitations that feel misaligned without excessive justification. Presence is cumulative self-trust, expressed physically. It cannot be faked long-term. It must be cultivated, not for applause, for peace. I do not need to dominate rooms. I need to feel unshaken inside them. And that begins before any words leave my mouth, because the body speaks first. And when my body says, I am steady here, most subtle aggression loses its leverage, not because I am invincible, but because I am contained. And containment is a language of its own. I stopped competing in rooms I had already outgrown. I used to believe that if someone challenged me, I had to respond, not because I was insecure, but because I thought engagement was proof of strength. If someone subtly compared achievements, I countered with my own. If someone measured lifestyles, I measured back. If someone tried to position themselves above me, I instinctively recalibrated the hierarchy. I told myself it was confidence. It wasn't. It was participation. The moment I realized this with clarity was in Miami, at a rooftop gathering overlooking the water. The air was humid, heavy with perfume and expensive conversations. Claire was there, immaculate as always, her tone casual but precise. She had a way of steering conversations into comparisons without appearing competitive. Travel destinations, investment returns, fitness routines, networking circles, every topic subtly curved back toward status. It wasn't hostile. It was polished. She asked me about my recent trip. Santa Fe, right? She said. I've been meaning to go, but I prefer Europe this time of year. The culture is just more layered. Layered. It was the kind of sentence designed to hover. The old version of me would have countered immediately. I would have mentioned the architecture in Santa Fe, on the art galleries, the quiet beauty of desert mornings. I would have escalated the conversation into a subtle comparison of experiences. Instead, I noticed something deeper. My body didn't feel threatened. It felt tired. Tired of performing worth in rooms where worth was constantly being measured. That night, I answered simply. It was exactly what I needed. No elaboration, no attempt to elevate the experience, no invitation for debate. Claire pivoted to her latest European trip, listing cities like credentials. I listened. I nodded. I asked one neutral question. Then I excused myself early. Not dramatically, not offended, just uninterested. That was new for me. For much of my adult life, I confused disengagement with defeat. I thought walking away meant conceding something. Now I understand something different. Competing in rooms I have already outgrown is not strength, it is regression. There is a specific kind of competition that appears among capable women in midlife. It is rarely overt. It does not look like high school rivalry. It looks like lifestyle comparison, like subtle tone shifts, like highlighting sacrifices to imply moral superiority. I could never work that much. I don't know how you travel alone. I'd miss my family too much. I've always prioritized balance. None of these statements are direct attacks, but they contain implied hierarchies. For years, I responded to those hierarchies by defending my own. Now I see that doing so reinforces the structure itself. When I engage, I validate the premise that we are racing. But what if we are not even on the same track? Competition only works if both parties agree to the same metric. At some point in my 40s, I realized that I no longer cared about many of the metrics being presented. I do not need to prove that my career is more meaningful. I do not need to prove that my marriage ending was justified. I do not need to prove that my body is disciplined enough. I do not need to prove that my social calendar is curated. If someone wants to measure, they are free to measure. I do not have to step on the scale. This shift required more than willpower. It required identity. When I was younger, external validation still carried weight. Achievements, admiration, even subtle envy, they felt like confirmation. Now validation feels quieter. I validate myself through alignment. Does this room align with my values? Does this conversation expand me? And does this dynamic feel reciprocal? If the answer is no, I do not escalate. I withdraw. Withdrawal does not mean isolation. It means redirection. There are rooms that energize me, conversations that stimulate, women who speak without measuring, men who listen without competing. I invest there. The night in Miami, I left early and walked along the water alone. The skyline shimmered behind me. My phone buzzed with messages from the gathering. I did not respond. I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that I did not have to perform. Relief that I did not have to subtly defend my choices. Relief that I could choose distance without explanation. Distance is often misunderstood. It is not punishment. It is protection. After that night, I began auditing my environments, not obsessively, but honestly. Which rooms make me feel expansive? Which rooms make me feel evaluated? Which conversations feel like connection? Which feel like comparison disguised as curiosity? I did not confront anyone. I did not announce boundaries. I simply adjusted access. Some invitations I declined. Some group chats I muted. Some social media accounts I unfollowed quietly. Digital competition can be as draining as physical rooms. The endless stream of curated lives invites subconscious comparison. I used to scroll and feel a subtle tightening in my chest. Now I curate what I consume, not to avoid reality, but to protect perspective. Financial independence has also shifted my tolerance for competition. When I depended more heavily on social approval or professional alliances, I engaged more carefully. I calculated responses. I weighed impressions. Now, I recognize that I can afford to walk away, not financially only, emotionally. That is a different kind of wealth. The older I get, the more I value internal quiet over external ranking. There is something almost juvenile about constant comparison, but it persists in adult spaces because insecurity persists. I no longer judge it. I simply decline participation. There was a time when Claire's comments might have lingered in my mind for days. I would have replayed them. crafted better responses in hindsight, wondered if I appeared defensive or unimpressive. Now they pass, not because I am above comparison, but because I am no longer invested in winning it. Winning requires engagement, and engagement requires energy. I am selective with mine. This does not mean I have no ambition. It means my ambition is no longer relational. It is personal. I measure growth against my past self, and not against the woman across the table. I evaluate progress by alignment, not applause. When I stopped competing in rooms I had already outgrown, I noticed something unexpected. Some people intensified. They escalated comparison when I withdrew, as if trying to pull me back into the race. That reaction confirmed everything. If my disengagement triggers someone, it reveals how much they depended on my participation. But I am not responsible for sustaining dynamics that drain me. There's a quote about wrestling in the mud with a pig. Both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. I used to interpret that as arrogance. Now I interpret it as clarity. Not every challenge deserves dignity. Not every comparison deserves acknowledgement. Sometimes the highest expression of confidence is absence. Absence from unnecessary debates. An absence from subtle status games. Absence from rooms that require constant proof. When I left that rooftop in Miami, I did not feel superior. I felt unburdened. And unburdened is a better measure than victorious. In midlife, energy becomes currency. I cannot afford to spend it on proving my value to people who are committed to measuring theirs. There are rooms I have outgrown, not because I am better, but because I am different. And different does not require defense. It requires discernment. Discernment to know when a conversation is connection and when it is competition. Discernment to know when engagement is growth and when it is regression. Discernment to know when staying is loyalty and when leaving is wisdom. I no longer need to win. I need to remain aligned. And alignment often means stepping out of races I never agreed to run. On the mirror strategy. There is a particular kind of comment that is designed to bruise without leaving fingerprints. It is delivered lightly, sometimes with a smile, often in front of other people, just sharp enough to register, just vague enough to deny. For most of my life, I handled those comments in one of two ways. I either absorbed them silently, pretending they didn't land, or I countered them directly, which almost always escalated the situation. Neither approach felt clean. Absorbing left residue, attacking created chaos. The shift came at a family gathering in Denver. It was early evening. The house was warm, too warm, full of overlapping conversations and the smell of roasted vegetables. I was standing near the kitchen island when a relative, one who has always had a talent for strategic commentary, tilted her head and said, and almost casually, "Well, marriage is hard to maintain." The sentence floated there. There was no direct accusation, no explicit judgment. But everyone within earshot knew what it referenced: my divorce. The old version of me would have done one of two things. I might have laughed it off and changed the subject, pretending I didn't feel the sting. Or I might have launched into a defense of the years I invested, the counseling sessions, the compromises, the exhaustion. Both options would have centered her implication. Instead, I tried something different. I looked at her calmly, and I said softly, "Are you okay?" That sounded heavy. It was not sarcastic. It was not theatrical. It was sincere in tone, even if it was strategic in structure. Something shifted instantly. The energy in the room moved away from me and toward her. She blinked. "Oh, I just mean, relationships take work." "I agree," I said gently. "They do." And then I stopped. I did not expand. I did not clarify. I did not defend. I simply held the mirror. That is what the mirror strategy is. It is not retaliation, it is reflection. When someone projects insecurity, envy, or resentment, they expect either compliance or combat. They expect me to shrink or to swing. They rarely expect to see themselves. Most subtle aggression relies on distortion. If someone implies I failed at marriage, and I rush to defend myself, the narrative remains that I failed. If someone implies I am too ambitious, and I argue for balance, the narrative remains that I am excessive. But if I calmly redirect the focus to the tone or intention behind their statement, the distortion becomes visible. Mirroring is delicate. It cannot be laced with hostility. If my voice tightens, if my eyes narrow, if my tone sharpens, the strategy collapses into confrontation. The power lies in steadiness. In Denver, what unsettled her was not the content of my response. It was the calm. Toxic behavior thrives in emotional fog. When I respond with clarity instead of reaction, I turn on the lights, and light is destabilizing to manipulation. I began using this approach more consciously, not in every situation, but when the subtext was undeniable. If someone says, "You've changed," in a tone that implies disapproval, I might respond, "What about that feels uncomfortable for you?" If someone says, "I could never prioritize work like that," I might reply, "What does prioritizing look like for you?" Notice what happens. The spotlight shifts. The assumption is no longer centered on me. The underlying motive begins to surface. Sometimes the other person softens and reveals vulnerability. Sometimes they retreat. Sometimes they become defensive. Each reaction tells me more than the original comment ever could. The mirror does not create tension. It reveals it. There is an important distinction here. Mirroring is not about humiliating someone. It is not about exposing them publicly. It is about refusing to carry what is not mine. For years, I carried other people's projections as if they were feedback. If someone felt threatened by my career, I internalized it as a need to soften my ambition. If someone felt insecure about my independence, I internalized it as a need to appear more dependent. If someone felt uncomfortable with my boundaries, and I internalized it as a need to be more accommodating. The mirror strategy interrupts that pattern. It says gently, "This belongs to you." At the Miami gathering with Claire, I experimented with this subtly. When she began listing her European destinations with a certain precision, she paused and looked at me. "And you?" she asked. "Any big plans that can compete with that?" The word compete hung there. I could have laughed, deflected, escalated. Instead, I smiled slightly. "Compete," I repeated softly. "I'm not sure I see it that way." It wasn't accusatory, it was curious. She hesitated. "Oh, I just meant travel in general." "I travel for what nourishes me," I said calmly. And I let the sentence stand. The mirror in that moment was subtle. I did not accuse her of competing. I reflected the premise back gently. Often that is enough. John, the most destabilizing thing for someone who relies on undercurrent tactics is to have the undercurrent named. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply acknowledged. There is a psychological reason this works. Subtle aggression depends on ambiguity. It needs plausible deniability. The moment ambiguity is clarified, the aggressor must either own their intention or retreat. Most retreat, because owning it would expose insecurity. Mirroring requires emotional regulation. If I am still activated, if I am still stung, I am not in a position to reflect cleanly. That is why silence and presence mattered first. They gave me the steadiness required to hold the mirror without shaking. In professional settings, I use this sparingly. If someone in a meeting implies that I am overcomplicating something, I might respond with, "Can you be specific about what feels unclear?" Not defensive, not sarcastic, specific. Specificity dissolves vague criticism. If someone continues vaguely, their lack of substance becomes visible to everyone else. I do not need to attack. The mirror does the work. In personal relationships, this approach has been transformative. When someone close to me becomes passive-aggressive, instead of pretending not to notice, I might say, "It sounds like something is bothering you." Not, "Why are you being passive-aggressive?" But, "It sounds like something is bothering you." It invites honesty without accusation. If honesty emerges, there is room for connection. If it doesn't, the tension belongs where it originated. The mirror also protects my internal narrative. If someone attempts to rewrite my story about my divorce, my ambition, on my solitude, I do not scramble to reclaim it. I hold it steady and reflect the distortion back. Is that how you see it? Sometimes that is all it takes. There is strength in allowing someone to hear their own words echoed calmly. It forces awareness, and awareness often curbs repetition. The older I get, the less interested I am in winning arguments. I am interested in preserving clarity. Mirroring preserves clarity. It prevents me from absorbing misplaced emotion. It prevents me from defending against projections. It prevents me from escalating unnecessarily. It also reveals who is capable of self-reflection and who is not. If someone responds to mirroring with introspection, there is potential for depth. If someone responds with increased hostility, there is clarity about their limitations. Either way, I gain information. At that gathering in Denver, after my relative recovered from my question, she did not bring up my marriage again that night, not because I embarrassed her, but because she saw herself in the reflection, and perhaps that was enough. The mirror strategy is quiet. It is subtle. It requires patience and control, but it has changed the way I move through complicated spaces. I no longer absorb sharp edges. I reflect them, gently, steadily, without carrying what was never mine to hold. I rose higher instead of fighting harder. For most of my adult life, I believed strength meant endurance. If something was uncomfortable, I stayed. If someone was difficult, I managed it. If a dynamic was draining, I adjusted myself to survive inside it. I told myself that resilience required proximity to friction, when that maturity meant learning how to coexist with people who unsettled me. That leaving was avoidance. I don't believe that anymore. The most powerful shift in my 40s was not learning how to outmaneuver difficult people. It was learning how to outgrow them. There is a quiet difference. Fighting harder keeps me at the same altitude as the conflict. Rising higher changes the landscape entirely. After the dinner in Chicago with Melissa, after the boardroom in Seattle, after the rooftop in Miami with Claire, after the gathering in Denver, I noticed a pattern. The same personalities resurfaced in different forms: the subtle underminer, the competitive comparator, the passive-aggressive relative, the colleague who thrives on interruption. I could refine my responses endlessly. I could perfect silence. I could master mirroring. But eventually I had to confront a harder question. Why am I still in spaces where this is a pattern? Not every environment deserves my adaptation. Some environments deserve my absence. This realization did not come with drama. It came with fatigue. A deep, bone-level fatigue of constantly managing dynamics that no longer aligned with who I was becoming. I began auditing my access points. Who has regular access to my time? Who has access to my emotional bandwidth? Who has access to my vulnerability? Access is currency. For years, I handed it out generously, believing generosity was virtue. Now I see that discernment is also virtue. I did not announce my shift. I did not confront Melissa about her tone. I did not call out Claire's comparisons. I did not stage interventions in Denver. I simply recalibrated proximity. Invitations became optional. Group messages went unanswered. Professional collaborations were chosen more carefully. Conversations shortened. Not cold, not dramatic, just measured. Distance is often misunderstood as hostility. It is not. It is clarity expressed physically. There's something transformative about geographic distance, too. After the Miami event, I booked a solo trip to Santa Fe again. Not to escape, to recalibrate. Desert mornings have a way of clarifying noise. The air is thinner. The sky feels endless. There is space to hear my own thoughts without interference. In that stillness, I realized something essential. I do not need to defeat anyone. I need to detach. Detachment is not indifference to humanity. It is indifference to unnecessary friction. For years, I believed that if someone disliked me, I needed to fix it. And if someone competed with me, I needed to win. If someone undermined me, I needed to counter. Now I ask a different question. Does this person have the altitude to meet me where I am going? If not, I do not descend to meet them. I continue climbing. Climbing does not always look glamorous. It looks like waking up early to work out when I would rather scroll. It looks like investing in therapy when it would be easier to vent. It looks like refining my professional skills quietly instead of broadcasting them. It looks like reading instead of arguing. It looks like choosing Charleston for a quiet weekend instead of attending another crowded social gathering where comparison hums beneath conversation. Rising higher is often invisible. No one applauds internal growth. No one announces when you stop engaging in petty dynamics. But the altitude difference becomes obvious over time. When I reduced contact with certain people, something predictable happened. Some of them reached out more intensely. Text messages with subtle guilt. Invitations framed as obligations. Comments about how distant I seemed. That is the turbulence of elevation. When access narrows, those who benefited from it feel the loss. But access is not a public utility. It is personal property. I used to confuse loyalty with endurance. I thought being a good friend, colleague, relative, meant tolerating behavior that quietly eroded me. Now I understand loyalty includes loyalty to myself. There is a particular kind of revenge culture that glorifies dramatic success as retaliation. Private jets, European vacations, public displays of achievement meant to signal, "Look how far I've gone." That never resonated with me. My elevation is quieter. It looks like peace. It looks like walking into a room and feeling neutral instead of braced. It looks like sleeping through the night without replaying conversations. It looks like declining a dinner invitation without rehearsing excuses. It looks like choosing projects that align with my values instead of chasing validation. The higher I climb internally, the smaller certain conflicts appear. What once felt urgent now feels trivial. What once felt threatening now feels revealing. When I encounter someone who tries to provoke me now, I assess quickly. Is this a moment for silence? Is this a moment for mirroring? Or is this simply a moment to disengage entirely? Sometimes disengagement is the cleanest response. There are conversations I no longer attend. There are debates I do not enter. There are explanations I do not provide. It is not about superiority. It is about stewardship of energy. Midlife changes the math. Time feels more precious. Energy feels finite. Peace feels non-negotiable. The older I get, the more I understand that fighting harder often anchors me to the very dynamic I want to escape. Rising higher requires different investments. It requires discipline in private. It requires discomfort in growth. It requires solitude at times. but it also requires courage. The courage to be misunderstood temporarily. The courage to be labeled distant. The courage to disappoint people who were comfortable with my previous accessibility. In Denver, months after that gathering, I noticed something subtle. The relative who had commented on my marriage shifted her tone around me, and less commentary, more neutrality. Not because I confronted her, because I was less available for commentary. In Chicago, Melissa's remarks softened over time, not because I corrected her, because she no longer received visible impact. In Miami, my presence in certain circles decreased, not because I was excluded, because I chose different rooms. Elevation changes social architecture. Some people fall away naturally, some adjust, some escalate briefly before fading. But the key difference is internal. I no longer feel the need to fight for air in rooms that feel tight. I step outside, and outside there is space. Space to think, space to expand, space to become. Rising higher is not about status. It is about clarity. It is about recognizing that not every conflict is a test of strength. Some are simply invitations to stagnate. I do not accept those invitations anymore. If someone tries to drag me into comparison, I let them run alone. If someone tries to bait me into defense, I remain anchored. If someone tries to provoke insecurity, I redirect my focus to growth. The most disarming response to subtle hostility is not aggression. It is progress. Quiet, consistent, unannounced progress. And progress often requires distance. Distance from noise. Distance from projection. Distance from rooms that shrink me. I used to think strength meant standing my ground in every confrontation. Now I know strength sometimes means relocating entirely, climbing, expanding, outgrowing. And in that elevation, something unexpected happens. The people who once seemed powerful shrink into background noise, not because I diminished them, but because I increased my altitude. Oh, I did not become cold. I did not become ruthless. I became selective. Selective about proximity. Selective about engagement. Selective about where I place my energy. And in that selectivity, I found something I had been searching for quietly all along. Not dominance, not victory, peace. When I look back at the woman I was 10 or 15 years ago, I don't see weakness. I see effort. I see a woman trying very hard to be composed, reasonable, successful, and kind, all at the same time. I see someone who believed that strength meant endurance, that maturity meant absorbing tension without flinching, that intelligence meant always having the right response ready. I wasn't collapsing under pressure. I was functioning. I was paying my bills, advancing in my career, maintaining relationships, showing up to family gatherings, and sitting at dinner tables in Chicago, walking into boardrooms in Seattle, attending social events in Miami, smiling politely in Denver. From the outside, I looked fine, but internally, I was constantly bracing for the subtle comment, bracing for the comparison, bracing for the interruption, bracing for the implication that I was too much or not enough. I didn't call it bullying. It felt too dramatic for that word. But what I was experiencing was a pattern, subtle undermining, social testing, competitive energy disguised as conversation. And for years, I handled it the only way I knew how, by engaging. I reacted, I explained, I defended, I competed, I absorbed. And every time I did, I unknowingly reinforced the dynamic. The shift in my life didn't come from becoming sharper or louder. It came from becoming still. As I stopped reacting on demand, I stopped stepping into other people's narratives about who I was supposed to be. I stopped filling silence out of discomfort. I stopped competing in rooms that no longer aligned with my values. I started holding up mirrors instead of swinging back, and eventually, I stopped fighting altogether. Not because I lost, because I rose. Rising higher didn't look like dramatic success or visible revenge. It looked like distance. It looked like better boundaries. It looked like less access. It looked like choosing rooms that felt expansive instead of evaluative. It looked like peace. And peace, I've learned, is not passive. It is built through micro decisions, through the pause before responding, through the choice not to defend, through the discipline of silence, through the courage to disengage. The deepest lesson I learned is this: most subtle aggression survives on participation. When I participate, emotionally, verbally, competitively, I feed it. When I withhold participation, it loses oxygen. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean withdrawing from life. It means becoming selective. Selective with my reaction, selective with my explanations, selective with my access, selective with my energy. And this is where it becomes relevant to you. If you are a woman between 35 and 60, financially independent, capable, responsible, you are likely the stable one in many rooms. You are the one who manages, smooths, regulates, endures. You are not looking for motivation. You are looking for relief. Relief comes when you stop assuming every tension requires your management. Here is how you can begin applying this in your life right now. First, practice delayed reaction. The next time someone makes a comment that unsettles you, do nothing for 5 seconds. Breathe. Let the discomfort settle back where it belongs. Second, stop over-explaining. If someone misunderstands you, ask yourself, does this misunderstanding truly require correction? Or am I trying to control perception? Third, observe competition without engaging. When comparison surfaces, refuse the race internally. You don't need to win what you didn't agree to run. Fourth, audit access. Who consistently leaves you feeling drained? Where can you create gentle distance without drama? These shifts are subtle. They won't create applause, but over time they will create altitude, and altitude changes perspective. You will notice that people who once felt intimidating now feel small, not because you diminished them, but because you stopped orbiting them. You will notice that silence feels powerful instead of awkward. You will notice that fewer words carry more weight. You will notice that your nervous system feels calmer in rooms that once triggered you. This is not about becoming untouchable in a dramatic sense. It is about becoming internally steady. There is a difference between being invulnerable and being anchored. You do not need to be invulnerable. You need to be anchored. If this story resonates with you, I want to ask you something simple. When someone subtly challenges you, what is your instinct? A. I explain myself immediately and try to clear it up. B. I pause and observe before deciding whether to respond. Comment A or B below, and I want to see how many of us are still reflexively explaining and how many are beginning to pause. And beyond that, I'm genuinely curious. Which part of this journey felt most familiar to you? The reaction, the defense, the silence, the distance? Share your perspective in the comments so other women here can see they are not alone. If this space feels honest to you, not loud, not dramatic, just real, subscribe to the channel. That support is what allows me to continue creating conversations like this. Because the truth is simple and steady. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Tom Tat Noi Dung. This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. This video explores the truth many accomplished women rarely say out loud. Bullying didn't end in high school. It evolved. It became polished, subtle, and socially acceptable. It hides in office meetings, family dinners, and concerned comments from other women. No one yells, no one leaves bruises, but you go home replaying conversations at midnight, wondering if you imagined the tension. The video speaks to the woman who is functioning, successful, composed, and exhausted, not from crisis, but from constantly absorbing, from explaining, from smoothing over subtle digs, from competing in rooms she has already outgrown. It unpacks how adult bullying thrives on reaction, how over-explaining quietly surrenders power, and how silence, presence, mirroring, and distance shift the dynamic without becoming cold. This isn't about revenge or dominance. It's about becoming selective with energy, about rising higher instead of fighting harder, and about realizing you were never too sensitive, just aware. You're not broken. You're just in the middle.